Harrison Ford, an enduring Hollywood icon who redefined heroism with Indiana Jones and once bore the weight of an entire galaxy as Han Solo, stands as a monument. He made the seemingly impossible become legendary and gave us all faith that bravery can triumph over any obstacle. He is the embodiment of adventure and the driving force behind the hopes and dreams of a whole generation. The cinematic record will always include that voice, those eyes, and that presence. The fire he kindled in our hearts will remain unquenched by the passage of time. A man who has weathered storms powerful enough to crush anyone lies behind the glitz and timeless titles like Han Solo or Indiana Jones. After his marriages crumbled, Harrison Ford soared again. As he watched his darling daughter fight against the devastating effects of epilepsy, he felt an immense burden. He weathered the terrifying moment his plane went down, but the trauma he suffered will last a lifetime. Anything that is visible or concealed is proof of sufferings that not even the glare of celebrity could erase. But Ford, like the heroes he had formerly personified, rose to his feet once more. Though wounded, we shall never be vanquished. He bears the unwavering determination of a man who defies adversity. The question continues to hurt our hearts, even at the age of 83. Is the sadness not becoming any worse? What anguish afflicts this legendary figure in his life's last chapter? As a sincere tribute to the man who brought us everlasting heroes and who is currently engaged in a terrifying struggle that no camera has ever captured, please hit like before we start. When Harrison Ford was younger, the crushing stillness of his boyhood was his biggest enemy, not evil empires or villains. Before he could even draw a breath as an actor, there was a hush that almost swallowed him. Far from the glittering lights of Hollywood, on July 13, 1942, in Chicago, Harrison Ford's journey started. It felt like theatrical acting was in Ford's destiny from the moment he was born into an artistic family. His father, Christopher, was a part-time actor, and his mother, Dorothy, was a former radio singer. But even as a youngster, the man who would later rule the galaxy as Han Solo and redefine heroism as Indiana Jones battled something much more personal and stifling, a crippling timidity that seemed like an unseen jail most of the time. Ford would confess with surprising candor, "I was a very shy kid." When reflecting on their childhood decades later, it was as if I didn't appear at home in any setting. His timidity had left a lasting impression on him by the time he was 10 years old. In the early 1950s, the dual identity that Ford received from his Jewish mother and Irish Catholic father gave him strength, but it also made him restless, as if he never quite belonged anywhere. He recalled sitting on the periphery of playgrounds and schools, observing the bonding of other children as he stayed hidden, a spectator. Scars were left behind by that agonizing loneliness, his formative years, molding a young man who cherished quiet more than mirth. However, even in those peaceful shadows, opportunities for adventure were sprouting. Being a Boy Scout at the age of 13, Ford experienced the boundless expanse of nature, the hushed murmur of trees, the placidity of lakes, and the boundless expanse of the sky above. Something that the classroom could never provide him. Nature did. Get out of there. Those liberating moments were a precursor to the fervor that would propel him into cockpits in the future. Soaring across the sky in search of the liberation he felt as a child. Unfortunately, the confines of school once again ensnared him in his timidity, serving as a constant reminder that he remained confined within himself. The conflict intensified during his adolescence. He was remembered by his teachers as a student who struggled academically and lacked when he enrolled in Wisconsin's Ripon College in the early 1960s. At the age of 18 or 19, the trend had already set in stone. He experienced a crushing sense of defeat while studying philosophy. Ford would subsequently come clean about his near flood and his feelings of being lost and invisible when he paced the college halls. The same demons from his youth continued to plague him. "What a lousy student I was," he remembered. "It was as if I didn't belong." There he stood, poised on the verge of loss, the young man who would become an inspiration to millions as a symbol of bravery. Then, almost out of nowhere, the turning moment occurred in his last year at Ripon in the early 1960s. It was desperation, not ambition, that drove him to enroll in an acting class, a final effort to escape the confines of stillness. The first hesitant step turned into the catalyst that set everything in motion. While performing, nervous but with unwavering resolve, he unearthed a voice that had been dormant behind a lifetime of anxiety. The once invisible youngster experienced a profound sense of being noticed, and the world started to hear him, although in a muted way. Nothing could ever erase the anguish he felt during those formative years of being invisible, alone, and burdened with an identity that caused him to feel out of place. Rather, it created an unbreakable object. That youthful struggle reverberated in every line he would later deliver, and in every risky part he would play. Harrison Ford was the only one who understood the truth, but everyone else would see him as a courageous hero. His silent, excruciating fight to break free of his own silence was his greatest victory, and it started long before the cameras rolled. Harrison Ford, who was just 22 years old when he came in 1964, had an ancient automobile, a shaky hope, and the conviction that Hollywood may take notice of him. He arrived in a city founded on dreams. A contract for $150 per week was offered to him by Columbia Pictures, a sum that appeared, for a while, briefly, as if it were a golden key. However, the reality was catastrophic. His roles were hardly visible, faces without names flashing over the screen, then disappearing as soon as the credits rolled. The child who had fought against the stifling quiet of his youth was now being consumed by an even more brutal stillness. Being invisible in a city where everyone is recognized brings a certain stillness. Even now, years later, he can still feel the shame of auditions, where instantaneous judgment was handed down to him. They'd make the call when I walked in. Even before I spoke a word, I was wrong. Rejection letters couldn't have hurt more than the crushing disappointment of leaving those rooms empty. He discovered that the unseen were not spared by Hollywood. Ford wed Markwood in the same year. In his mid-20s he had evolved into more than just an actor on a mission. As time went on, he became a spouse and the proud parent of 2 young children. Being a father warmed his soul, but it also crushed his will to live. Neither diapers nor a roof could be purchased with dreams. The rhythm of his existence had become severe by the time he was in his late 20s. All day long, auditions, all night long, rejection, and through it all, the intolerable silence of children's queries that he was ill-equipped to answer. He learned carpentry out of pure desperation, learning how to work with a saw, sander, and woodworking tools. Carpenter paid the bills, but he was broken emotionally and spiritually, as he would admit with harsh honesty later on. The aspiration that had originally driven him west felt like it was being laid to rest with each table he constructed. During the early 1970s, Ford was already in his 30s, when his contemporaries were starting to make a reputation for themselves. As he stayed a ghost in the City of Lights, he saw friends become stars. Years later, he confessed, "I felt like a failure," meaning he didn't think he belonged in the acting industry. Not because he was striking heavier wood with his hammer, but because the weight of his obligation was piling up with each passing day. Looking at his kids brought him an overwhelming mix of joy and pain. His responsibility and the nagging, painful question lingered in the background. Is it possible for him to provide children with safety as he stubbornly holds on to a dream that has rejected him? Even the hero who would later represent unbreakable heroes felt as weak as a man in those years. Still something persisted despite the misery and sawdust in his workspace. He remained connected to the world that had closed its doors as he built cabinets for Hollywood's elite. He did not appear on set brandishing a blaster or whip. Even as he sanded chairs and fixed doors, an indomitable spirit burned in his eyes, unquenchable by rejection. Even if he tried to bury his optimism, it would remain alive. In 1973, at the age of 31, fate finally opened the door open. In American Graffiti, George Lucas cast him in a minor but significant role. That he was not destined for obscurity was demonstrated to both the world and himself. There was still a transitional period between the two mediums, from wood to film, from survival to fate, up to 1976. The man who would soon be hard to ignore was being forged by the steel of every humiliation, grief, scar, and splinter from that invisible decade. In Hollywood, Harrison Ford remained an enigma. However, a myth was quietly taking shape in the crucible of hopelessness. Finally, destiny beckoned from the depths of rejection. It arrived in the most improbable way: a job as a carpenter. Harrison Ford, who was in his early 30s at the time, was a Hollywood insider who used to sand wood and fix cabinets. Then, in the mid-1970s, fate brought him into the orbit of a young, inexperienced director named George Lucas. As a result of a An unexpected invitation to read lines for an odd little space opera that nobody thought would be successful turned the commission into an unfathomable opportunity. Instead of a famous actor, Ford was a struggling carpenter when he entered that audition room. As Han Solo, he strode out. The carpenter disappeared, and a myth was established with Star Wars in 1977. A rebellion echoed through galaxies, sparked by Ford's sneer, swagger, and mere presence. Finally, Hollywood's elusive leading man had been spotted. The horrible irony, though, was that the very light that had saved him had also exposed him to a world that cared just about the legend and not the man. Once more, lightning struck. A rumbling hulk appeared on screens in 1981 with Raiders of the Lost Ark, with a fedora, tipped against the sun, and a whip in hand. The Ford revolutionized adventure for centuries. There was more to Indiana Jones than meets the eye. An integral part of the 20th century, it caused a tremor in popular culture. As he portrayed Han Solo and Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford bore the weight of not only films, but also whole myth. But the price of immortality was something he was cognizant of. You can't just walk away from them, he would confess months later. They trail you about like a shadow. The roles that made him unstoppable also bound him to them indefinitely, casting long shadows that would at times engulf the man he was. But he still wouldn't be contained by franchises on their own. The sad man in Blade Runner 1982 questioned humanity's very essence, and he carried that burden with him. Oscar consideration for his understated passion in 1985's Witness proved that, beyond the Hollywood veneer, he was a genuine actor. While composing, he transformed his frustration into rebellion in 1993's Fugitive, and in 1997's Air Force One. He personified the unyielding resolve of the United States, dominating the screen with an intensity that muddled the boundary between reality and patriotism. A mythological and emotional empire was constructed as each role built upon the previous one. The victories offered benefits that were unfathomable. The initial Star Wars investment was $10,000, whereas Indiana received $65 million. The enormous success of his films, such as Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, was directly proportional to his salary. His films had earned over $9 billion worldwide by the 1990s, making him one of the most successful actors of all time. The once quiet young man, uncertain of his place in the world, now stood as a cinematic icon, his name etched into infinity. Despite the deafening roar of the crowd's applause, the stillness ensued. He was now more famous than he had ever imagined, but it encircled him like an indestructible mask. He could conquer the world, defying death at every turn. Han, Indy, the President, and the Fugitive. Still, in the stillness, Ford struggled with the harder reality that he had become into, more of a symbol than an individual, more of a monument than a man. Even though he became immortal in the spotlight, he lost his obscurity, repose, and the delicate peace that all humans seek. The harsh irony of his existence persisted. Therefore, the world was conquered by Harrison Ford, but by doing so, he transformed into something from which not even he could ever truly escape. Once born, cannot be let die. Although his rise to fame made him a legend, it tore the peaceful haven of his personal life to shreds. As Han Solo, the man the world adored, returned home night after night to a marriage that was buckling under the pressure of his success. The lady who had earlier been known as Mary Marquardt and watched helplessly as the family she had built with her own sacrifices started to fall apart as she guided him toward obscurity. Harrison was far from famous when he wed Mary in 1964. He had more experience with rejection papers than applause, as a 22-year-old dreamer who was barely squeaking by. Despite everyone else's doubts, Mary had faith. There was employment for her. The house was held together by her. Despite her husband's hunched shoulders and haunted eyes upon his return after unsuccessful auditions, she quietly endured the humiliations of poverty. She persevered through the years when she had to work as a carpenter to make ends meet, and even he began to question whether acting was a pipe dream. She was his safety net for over a decade, catching him whenever the world failed. On the other hand, 1977 was the year the tide changed violently, beyond their wildest dreams. Star Wars became an instant hit. In the blink of an eye, the previously unseen man became a household name throughout the world. Ford was a courageous and rebellious hero to millions. Mary saw him as an unknown person taken in by the world at large. Failure was something she had once shared with him. She had no choice but to share him with the public now. Asterisk, asterisk, unlike failure, celebrity is brutal. The days got shorter, more space is available, and the closeness that had previously held them together vanished into thin air. Those are roles you can't just abandon. Afterwards, Ford would consider, but Mary was well aware of it. He had not simply abandoned roles. Slowly but surely, he was separating himself from her. Then the murmurs, with their awful timing, came. A romance rumor involving Carrie Fisher spread. Cracks appeared in the delicate glass as news of the princess's appearance on screen and, maybe, in real life spread. Whether it was the truth or rumors, it hurt Mary more than betrayal ever could. It was the epiphany that the same dream she had battled for so desperately had betrayed her. His immortality was too much for her to bear, even though she had weathered his invisibility. In 1979, the couple's marriage had ended. Instead of a raucous, the kind of quiet that reverberates in children's hearts, marked the end of 15 years of commitment. Ben and Willard, their 2 boys, saw their parents divorce in the bright lights of Hollywood. Even though he was worshipped by everyone else, this father could not even keep his own family united. According to them, it was chaos for Mary, and nobody was watching. A silent obituary for her husband, as the world rejoiced over his ascent. In her latter years, Ford hardly mentioned Mary. Maybe that was because her memories of him reflected both the man she trusted and the one who let her go. His first great love was sacrificed on the altar of fame. A quieter and crueler truth that lies underneath Han Solo's bravado and Indiana Jones' stubbornness. Harrison Ford's life is paradoxical because he seemingly conquered galaxies in his film roles, but the most important battle he lost was the one he fought at home. The most important parts of Harrison Ford's personal life were still to come, even if fame had already stolen his first love. Melissa Matt was a talented screenwriter whose work had previously brought the world E.T., a story about connection, loss, and the desire to return home. In the aftermath of his divorce from Mary Marquardt, he found comfort in her embrace. Melissa was his partner, whilst Mary had been his obscurity's companion. To his victory, they were wed in 1983. It appeared for a time that Ford had at last discovered a second opportunity at tranquility. Malcolm and Georgia, their 2 children, were constantly making noise in the house. The man whose life had been molded by isolation felt the melody of community for a little period of time. However, darkness swiftly encroached over their haven. Their daughter Georgia's epilepsy diagnosis brought a new type of anguish that neither celebrity nor riches could alleviate. Protect from now when his child was having seizures. Ford, who had spent decades playing heroes who could withstand anything, felt helpless. His friends remembered that whenever he brought up her condition, he would remain silent, as if the weight of his powerlessness were too great for words. As a last resort, he auctioned off his legendary Han Solo jacketer, representation of his greatest achievement, in order to raise money for cure research. Everyone saw it as a generous gesture. Ford perceived it as something on the verge of pleading. A father frantically clung to the shadows, attempting to trade his daughter's health for stardom. Melissa handled the pain in a unique way. First and foremost, she was a mother. She became George's unwavering protector when his health was deteriorating. All the while her marriage was straining from Ford's absences and the merciless demands of fame. Her refusal to make her private suffering public and her quiet dignity were noted by her colleagues. However, hidden behind keeping her cool was like being a lonely person watching your family fall apart as you bore the brunt of a sick child, and the invisible scars of being in the shadow of a man who millions of people loved but who was not there for you. Their union was beginning to crumble by the late 90s. Film sets and the never-ending wave of fame engulfed Ford, making him a worldwide figure. Despite Melissa's brilliance and accomplishments, she seemed to be left out of his life story as she grew more and more solitary. Upon finishing more than they were married for 20 years before they divorced, no amount could possibly capture the incalculable cost of the $85 million divorce settlement that made headlines. It was the gradual agony of seeing a love that had lasted 20 years fade into oblivion for Melissa. Another family's lives shattered, and Ford was reminded once again that he could rule the galaxy on screen, but not the delicate domain of a home. Both of their parents' talents were passed down to their children, Malcolm and Georgia, and the separation of a family's scar tissue. Yet the final blow was dealt by fate 10 years down the road. Neuroendocrine cancer was Melissa Matt's diagnosis in 2015. At 65 years old, she passed away within a few months. The news emptied Ford, even though he had remarried at that point. His unusual quiet and apparent inwardness were remarked by the reporters. In Ford's eyes, Melissa was more than just an ex-wife. During the years when a struggling carpenter became a world legend, she had been there to watch it all. The woman who carried him up the mountain and nurtured his children. Her passing was more than simply another Hollywood headline. It had erased a part of his identity. According to friends, after Melissa passed away, Ford appeared depleted, as if his sadness had finally peeled back the layers of his mythology. Given that he had spent his entire life characterized by aches, shattered bones, and daring feats, this was a knockout punch that no act of valor could overcome. The legendary actor who had escaped death on screen now sat helpless in the face of its inevitable conclusion. After Melissa's death, Ford avoided talking about her for a long time. As he did so, his speech was choppy and his pauses lengthy, as if he were afraid to speak for fear of reliving a pain he had learned to bear silently. That stillness spoke volumes to his closest friends and family. That was when unspoken grief of a husband bereaved twice, a parent who had prayed to fate without success, an individual who recognized that certain conflicts are unwinnable. Instead of a Hollywood romance, Ford and Melissa's life together was a series of unforgiving hardships. A tragic disease in a daughter, a marriage that couldn't withstand the spotlight, and finally, a death that made all losses permanent. The world continued to see him as the courageous champion. The guy he was on the inside was a man scarred by loss, failure, and the intolerable truth that heroes can't rescue the ones they care about. Finally, there was complete quiet. The loss of a mother and the subsequent hush that descended upon the home where they had formerly enjoyed so much joy and laughter. Ford had grown up in the midst of this stifling emptiness, and he had spent his entire life attempting to escape its clutches. However, it had returned with even more brutal power now that he was nearing the end of his life. He owed everything to his fame. Everything had been stripped away when Melissa was not there. Love can endure for decades. Though some burn brightly for a whole season, others produce reverberations that last far longer. Not a marriage, but a hidden affair was among the most subdued and unsettling parts of Harrison Ford's personal life. Affair with his co-star Carrie Fisher from Star Wars for 3 months. Production on an odd space opera that would go on to become a smash hit started in 1976, when nobody believed in it. Ford and Fisher drifted apart in the midst of London's costume mania, script revisions, and restless nights. She was incredibly sensitive, intelligent, and young at just 19 years old. At 34 years old, he was already a spouse and parent, and the pressures of celebrity were starting to get to him. While we watched, Han and Leia exchanged jabs and furious looks. Fiction off-screen become real. Furthermore, the chemistry that would be revered by the world in the future was not purely theatrical. Ford found solace in Carrie, a burst of joy under the crushing weight of responsibilities, a respite from the monotony of Hollywood and the gloom of a doomed marriage. Fisher saw Ford as gravity personified. She acknowledged in her memoir that she was captivated by his stability and mystique, but that the affair would never last. She admitted that it was wonderful while it lasted, but that it was fleeting. Their secret raged fiercely while burning for barely 3 months. They committed hours of unrecognized theft behind the scenes, soft murmurs in the changing rooms, longing glances that muddied the boundary between performance and life. Fisher confessed, decades later, that she occasionally questioned whether the on-screen looks conveyed more genuine emotion than acting. As soon as the cameras stopped following them, they both knew it would be over. Their delicate orbit also ended when filming concluded. With a stride, Ford resumed his life. Hers was the direction Fisher drew. Each one had a piece of an unspoken truth, fragile enough to not make it through the day. Nobody would ever suspect a thing. It will be 40 years. Fisher kept quiet while he protected the secret. Maybe because the pain was still there. Possibly because she was aware that some realities thrive in secrecy. Months before her death, in 2016, she wrote her memoir, The Princess Diarist. Finally releasing all of her pent-up emotions, she seemed to be letting go of a long-suffering ghost as she talked, rather than being resentful. Consistent with his character, Ford uttered few words. His remaining silent was a confession in and of itself, a subtle recognition of the truth of what they had spoken. The most significant conclusion followed. Carrie Fisher passed away abruptly at the age of 60 in December 2016. Princess Leia's death was felt by millions as they mourned the loss of the fighter who had inspired countless generations. Something sharper was it for Ford, putting an end to his relationship with a lady who viewed him as more than just a manor legend in her eyes. His statement was quite brief: unique, talented, creative, and hilarious. She was one in a million. However, his friends and family were aware of the sorrow that lay behind his constraint. Emptiness is sometimes greater than expression. As if it were an open sore, Ford bore this one. Their affair was noteworthy not because of any controversy, but because of the love and intensity it displayed. For Ford, Mary had been the rock of anonymity. Melissa, a staunch supporter during good times and bad. Quite different was Carrie, an elusive passion, careless and delicate, that flickered fiercely before fading away, leaving behind just shades. In a galaxy far, far away, Han and Leia will be remembered as lovers for all time. On the other hand, Ford is concerned about it's a heavier story. Fiction turned into reality for 3 months. After reality faded from his life, a subtle but persistent pain remained, buried deep within his memories. A lot of pain had been a part of his history. Breakups in relationships, heartbreak, and silences that never got better. However, in the early 2000s, it seemed as though destiny had finally had enough of tormenting him. It provided Harrison Ford with an alternative. Instead of a storm, a harbor. Callista Flockhart was where he discovered it. Unexpectedly, their paths crossed in 2002 at a Golden Globes bash. She was Ollie McKeel's younger star, and her charm and intelligence made her a star. He bore the burden of mythology and the scars of a life well lived, becoming the weathered icon in the process, overheard by the general public. Something surprisingly straightforward existed between them. Nevertheless, as soon as their gazes connected, there is no showmanship or pretense. Ford would come to confess that he was drawn to her warmth, generosity, and the way she made the hustle and bustle of Hollywood feel like a million miles away, rather than her fame. In private, away from prying eyes, their love blossomed. Ford had reached the age of wisdom when he could tell the difference between a raging passion and love's endurance. It was all about endurance for Callista. Despite the fact that Ford and Callista were unable to have a family of their own, he learned that blood ties are just as important as those formed via other marriages. She brought him to meet Liam, her adopted son. The boy was taken under Ford's wing as his own, despite the scars that complex fatherhood had left on him. Their connection was based on commitment rather than biology. His friends could feel his guarded edges easing, the man's restlessness settling in, and become something kinder. A new opportunity to become a father and to fall in love. Choice, rather than circumstance, shaped this period. Their intimate 2010 wedding took place in Santa Fe. Just 2 people making a romantic choice, no dramatic flourishes or flashing cameras. Not long after that, they settled down on a Wyoming ranch, away from the mayhem of Hollywood. Although he had invested after spending decades in the limelight, he gave in and settled into a life beneath the mountains, foregoing red carpets in favor of starry skies. The sound of Liam's laughter echoed across the fields as he rode his horse in the morning and sat by the fire in the evening. These became the patterns of a life where being present was more important than having a big payday or appearing in a premiere. Even if difficulties persisted, they manifested in new ways. The Globe anxiously awaited Ford's safe return from a 2015 plane disaster, but Callista did nothing more than remain by his side. Rather than being about marriage, those weeks are more appropriately characterized as a tale of survival. However, her unwavering commitment was of utmost importance. She could only muster 3 sentences when questioned afterwards about how she managed to stay alive. "I adore him." Maybe that sums up this chapter well. For a man whose past relationships, Callista became unique due to the wounds inflicted by fame, loss, and the trauma of being absent, being present. A constant flame, warming the icy spots his past had left behind, rather than a tempest of desire, a spectre of regret, or the myth that loomed over him on screen. Theirs is one of the few long-lasting, discreet, scandal-free unions in Hollywood today. Callista was always more than a third marriage to Harrison Ford. She was a silent testament to the fact that even legendary figures can find peace and sanctuary where their hearts can finally rest, no matter how battered and bruised they are. The idea of being unbreakable had been central to Harrison Ford's mythology for many years. He was the archaeologist who, with a grin and a whip, escaped death. The renegade who outran civilizations, and the man who never remained down. He was most helped by his own physique, streamlined, always on the go. Being untouchable was a concept he personified. He was the embodiment of resilience. However, stories are immortalized on film, not in real life. Even the strongest flesh gives way to rot. The pains and bruises from decades of defiant antics were a covert precursor to the betrayals. For as long as he could remember, Ford would not accept a replacement. It seemed inevitable that Indiana Jones would be the one to grapple with speeding trains or dangle from trucks. Sincerity was his guiding principle. That he captivated generations with his dogged determination. However, it also left wounds that could never be captured by a camera. Muscles that had previously recovered poorly were pushed to move again. After tearing ligaments and breaking bones, as he entered his 70s, the burden of past conflicts weighed heavily on his every step. With every breath, the price of stubbornly standing firm was murmured, but he persisted nevertheless. A former statement of his read, "I wanted it to be me." June 2014. The day that broke the illusion came along. If the audience was going to believe, it had to be me. A hydraulic door on the set of Star Wars. The Force Awakens crashed to the ground inside the Millennium Falcon, the ship that had propelled him to cinematic history. His leg was fractured in the impact, trapping him beneath the symbol that characterized him. The sight was intolerable for the shocked crew. The legendary Han Solo, who cheated the Empire once. The set went silent, work came to a standstill, and the myth lay wounded right in front of their eyes, broken not by stormtroopers or blasters, but by a steel machine. Emergency surgery was performed on Ford. The sight remained with those who stood in that studio, even if the world would later witness him laugh it off on television, showing the accident with a toy model. Severe irony was felt. He had become immortal, but his vulnerability had been exposed by the ship. The barrier between myth and reality was ripped apart for the first time, and the other side offered nothing but misery. Only a year after that, the illusion began to crumble even more. While piloting one of his cherished classic planes, Ford experienced a devastating engine failure in March 2015. The plane went down and slammed into a Los Angeles golf course. The debris was twisted to an unrecognizable state. A shocking echoes of doom haunts the landscape. The world thought the narrative had ended for what seemed like hours. Breaking news reports erupted. If the unbreakable had at last crumbled. His wife, Callista Flockhart, would subsequently admit that she was terrified during that time. While whispering, she said, "I thought I'd lost him." Her watch outside the intensive care unit. The world beheld Ford's survival as a miracle. Callista saw it as a resurrection. However, this miraculous feat was not without its cost. The man who had once personified youth had stared into the depths of death and emerged, changed, scarred, and altered. Ford made a full recovery. He did, in fact, walk, fly, and even return to the sets where he had once labored. However, there was a change in the expression on his face. Underneath his stoic shrugs and grally humor, an unspoken truth remained. He had never before been forced to admit the betrayal of his own body, which had carried him through on-screen battles, leaped from cliffs, and dodged rolling boulders. But now it had revealed itself for what it really was: mortal, fallible, and fragile. What broke him during that time wasn't simply a plane or door crashing. It was the harsh realization that no legend can survive the test of time. This was the deepest wound for Harrison Ford, the man who had spent decades inspiring faith in heroes. Nevertheless, his body demanded more from him. In 2021, at the age of nearly 80, he tore his shoulder while practicing a fight scene on set of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Production came to a standstill for weeks as he went through surgery and a slow recovery. It was cruel, ironic, that time itself had betrayed the eternal adventurer. When he finally got back on set, the cameras caught the truth. His frame was leaner, his movement slower, and his face carved with lines of triumph and suffering. But when the director called action, something inside him still ignited. Those closest to Ford noticed the truth. Callista notices the stiffness when he rises, the care in each step, the pauses he once never needed. At night, she hears him stir awake from old aches. For a few fleeting hours, Ford was Indy again, defying time with every swing of the whip and narrowing of the eyes. Even though he shrugs off questions about aging with grally humor, it beats the alternative. Fans cheered for Indiana Jones 5, but they were really saying farewell to Harrison Ford, who had given them his broken body piece by piece until it was no longer whole. The cruel irony, which Ford has admitted privately, is that the man who once embodied eternal youth now lives in a body that betrays him daily. Cannes 2023 brought this to the world's attention. Everything that made his story so relatable, the door that slammed him, the crash that almost killed him, the surgeries, the gradual betrayals of time are not failures but sacrifices. Every scar is evidence of a man who refused to back down, who devoted himself to his art and his audience. While others backed down, Ford stood firm, determined to fight until the end, even though his body became his battlefield. This is the last chapter of the legend, not the smuggler who laughed at empires, but Callista watches him in the solitude of their Wyoming ranch from time to time. He is older and slower, but his spirit is restless, and she marvels at his will that refuses to dim. She has said that he doesn't know how to stop, and perhaps that is why everyone loves him. His vulnerability makes his resilience shine brighter. Ford is not the same archaeologist who defied the passage of time. Rather, he is the man whose myths have outlived him, and he bears the scars where others bore the praise. His tragedies are not accidents, but inevitable consequences of aging, the painful realization that even heroes deteriorate with time. Despite this, he continues to stand firm. His physical form may be failing, but his will to resist is unwavering. This kind of defiance holds a different kind of immortality. Maybe the most heroic acts were never about acting invincible, but rather about standing scarred and mortal and daring to keep going. Seeing him fall is nearly unbearable for those who watched him jump, fight, and soar. But in his fall, Harrison Ford has given us a final gift, a reflection of our own humanity, fragile, resilient, unforgettable. Harrison Ford, at 83 years old, lives in a world of unparalleled wealth, but he is also haunted by pain, silence, and memories that no amount of money can erase. His net worth exceeds $300 million, and his name is attached to properties ranging from a penthouse in Manhattan to the Brentwood Hills in Los Angeles. From the expansive skies of his cherished Wyoming ranch to hangars, his wealth is a mirage. The world perceives it as a picture of triumph. Harrison Ford, who once built cabinets for rent money, now owns an empire of his own. Those closest to him, however, recognize the irony. He has never lived smaller, quieter, or more reclusive. His planes include vintage planes and sleek jets, as well as Jaguars that hum with history, Mercedes designed for speed, Teslas that fly quietly, and a Cessna Sovereign worth more than entire lifetimes of labor. A man in boots tending to the land, finding comfort in the rhythm of nature. He has built an empire, but what he craves is not more, only less. And in Wyoming, on that expansive 800-acre ranch, half of which he donated as a conservation easement, he chooses stillness over spectacle. The Hollywood lights that once followed his every step now flicker only occasionally at a Cannes premiere or a rare red carpet appearance. His home is with Callista Flockhart, the woman who has been by his side for over 20 years, and with Liam, the son she adopted before they met, a boy whom Ford had long ago accepted as his own. His marriage has not produced any children, so there are no new chapters of fatherhood to divert attention from past regrets. Rather, there is a more subdued redemption. Meals at the ranch, shared laughter by the fire, and the feeling that he is finally here. Ford, at 80 years old, carries the burden of 1,000 stunts and more than a few miracles of survival. His leg stiffens from the day the Millennium Falcon's door crushed him on the set of The Force Awakens, and his shoulder aches from the memory of 2021. He has learned to sit, listen, and stay after years of absence brought on by fame, filming, and broken families. His steady stride belies the slowness, caution, and pauses seen by those closest to him. Despite this, Indiana Jones continues to work out, fly planes, and maintain the discipline of a body that has been pushed to its limits. However, when he looks in the mirror, he can't help but hear the same truth. The indestructible man has aged. Cannes 2023 brought this truth to light for the world to see. As he took the stage for his audiences, were met with resounding applause as Harrison Ford, with his eyes moist with emotion and his voice quivering as he confessed, "I'm deeply moved," as he rode into the premiere of Indy's last adventure. However, the clapping served as more than simply a celebration. It was a farewell. It was more than simply an expression of appreciation. It was a farewell, a recognition of a chapter coming to a close, both in film and in life. To focus solely on his suffering would be to miss the more profound trajectory of his decline. Despite the fact that his body is betraying him, Harrison continues to sacrifice himself, not for the sake of financial success, but for causes that will outlive him. In his role as Vice Chair of Conservation International, he has battled for rivers and rainforests with the same dogged determination he displayed when fighting for authenticity on set. He has also donated land to preserve nature, provided his voice to environmental campaigns, and risked his reputation to speak the truth about climate change. Before activism was cool, he used his fortune to protect something bigger than himself. And maybe that's how he was measured, not by planes, or cars or movies, but by forests and skies and wild places that will be left when he's no longer among them. Then there's Private Ford, the man who risked his life to help with actual rescue flights, who has been known to use his helicopter to rescue hikers and climbers who got stuck. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that he is more than just an actor. He has saved lives in real life. The unseen, unfilmed, and uncelebrated heroism he has played is the most genuine role he has ever played. Despite his fame, he still carries the weight of his friends, loves, and even his myth of invulnerability. His wives, Mary Marquardt and Melissa Matt, went through heartbreak and illness and death, respectively. There are evenings when the ranch is very quiet and memory fills the silence. Wealth cannot protect him from that. What then is the legacy of a man who has lived so much, lost so much, and given so much? Perhaps it lies not only in Han, but also in Carrie Fisher, the spark of something forbidden, who vanished too soon, leaving silence in her place. Although bridges were built, the guilt lingers. Harrison Ford, at 83 years old, is neither the unstoppable hero of his youth nor the box office king of his middle years. He is something rare, a testament to endurance. Not to mention the smugness of Solo or the crack of Indiana Jones' whip, but to something more subtle, the ability to stagger forward, even when love breaks, when the body fails, and when time robs every illusion of immortality. Ford's story is more than just the triumph of a Hollywood star. It is the testimony of a man who has walked through fire, 3 marriages, broken bones, deathbeds, near-death crashes, and still risen, scarred but unbowed. The boy who built cabinets is no longer with us. The renegade who once outwitted empires has aged, but the man who has weathered the storm long enough to stand unadorned and true to himself. Rich, yes, but also beaten, softened, and deeply human. For millions, he will forever be Han Solo or Indiana Jones. For his family, he will always be husband, father, and finally present. In this final chapter, the archaeologist who laughed at death now lives with its shadow. Ford's legacy shines, brighter than any artifact, ship, or box office record. It is the legacy of resilience, of fragility turned into strength, of mortality worn with dignity. For all the world, he is still a reflection of reality. Legends die, heroes age, and myths must change with the times. The story ends not with a happy ending or a sad one, but with a deeper truth. Harrison Ford's unforgettableness lies not in his seemingly indestructible past, but in his daring to keep going even after that seemed lost. Now it's your turn. More Harrison Ford, who is now over 80 years old, has had a life filled with ups and downs, injuries and triumphs, but he has left an indelible mark on film and on life itself. What memories of him do you have? Is he most remembered as Indiana Jones, Han Solo, or someone else entirely? Let us remember this legend by sharing your memories in the comments. And if this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to honor the legend and the future wisdom that remains with him now.